Duke's nails scraped against the polished wood of the small white coffin, his deep barking shattering the reverent silence of Golden Pine's funeral home. Sarah Mason froze, her eulogy paper trembling between whitened knuckles. It wasn't grief in her German shepherd's amber eyes, it was desperation. For heaven's sake, someone remove that animal! Richard Atwood, the funeral director, lunged forward as mourners gasped. Barbara Jenkins, their 70-year-old neighbor, clutched her chest with gnarled fingers that once cradled 5 children of her own. Sarah stared at the beautiful maple coffin containing her 10-month-old son, Noah. The same coffin Duke refused to leave since arriving. The same coffin that felt oddly light when she had touched it moments ago, lighter than it should have been holding her baby boy. "Wait," Thomas whispered, grasping her elbow. "Something's not right." What did Duke sense that they couldn't? And why was Melinda, their nanny, inching toward the exit door? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Masons had moved to their modest lakeside cottage in Lakewood Shores 5 years ago, when Thomas still worked as an engineering executive for Midwest Infrastructure. Their white clapboard house with blue shutters sat on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, a place where summer brought tourists and wealth, but where locals often struggled through long winters with seasonal employment. Sarah taught 3rd grade at Lakewood Elementary, where her gentle patience made her a favorite among both students and parents. Thomas had lost his executive position during the recession, a blow that still haunted his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Now he worked construction, leaving before dawn and returning with hands calloused in ways his office job never caused. Duke had come to them 4 years ago from a shelter in Milwaukee, already 2 years old, with sad eyes and a hesitant trust. The shelter volunteers knew little about his background, except that he had been surrendered by someone who could no longer keep him. What they didn't know, what the Masons would only discover years later, was that Duke had received extensive training as a search and rescue dog before being deemed too protective for professional work. Noah had been their miracle after 3 devastating miscarriages. Sarah had given up hope until that positive test 14 months ago. The pregnancy had been difficult, with Sarah on bed rest for the final trimester. Duke had stayed by her side throughout, his head often resting gently on her growing belly as if already standing guard over the child within. When Noah arrived home from the hospital, Duke had appointed himself chief protector. He slept beside the crib, alerted them to every cry, and seemed to count family members constantly, especially when they were outdoors near the lake. They'd hired Melinda Walker 2 months ago through Perfect Care Agency when Sarah's teaching schedule became more demanding. Melinda came with glowing references and a warm smile. She was a psychology graduate who claimed to love children and animals, though Sarah had noticed Duke never quite warmed to her the way he did to other visitors. Barbara Jenkins lived next door, a 70-year-old widow whose husband had been a K-9 officer with the county sheriff's department until his death 5 years ago. Duke visited her porch every morning, sitting patiently until she emerged with coffee and often a treat. "That dog understands every word," Barbara would say. "Smartest animal I've known since my Harold's police dogs." What none of them realized was how these separate threads of their lives, Duke's mysterious past, Thomas's financial struggles, Melinda's 2 perfect references, and Barbara's knowledge of police dogs, would soon weave together into a tapestry of terror and hope, beginning with that terrible morning when Noah supposedly stopped breathing. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Sarah woke at 5:30 a.m., kissed Thomas goodbye as he left for the construction site, then padded to the nursery to check on Noah. The baby was sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath his favorite blue sleeper with sailboats. Duke lay beside the crib as always, raising his head briefly to acknowledge Sarah before resuming his watch. "You're such a good boy," Sarah whispered, scratching behind his ears. Duke had been restless the night before, scratching at their bedroom door repeatedly until Thomas had finally put him outside. Sarah had thought it strange, but dismissed it as Duke hearing a raccoon or deer in the yard. She showered quickly, dressed in a floral summer dress appropriate for the last week of school, and was making coffee when Melinda arrived. The nanny was 30 minutes early, which struck Sarah as unusual. "Oh, you're here already," Sarah said, pouring a second cup for the younger woman. "Everything okay?" "Perfect," Melinda replied, though her smile seemed tight. "I just couldn't sleep. Thought I might as well come early and let you get a head start." She set her oversized purse on the counter with a soft thud. "I'll give Noah his bottle when he wakes up. You should go, end-of-year preparations and all that." Duke had followed Melinda into the kitchen, his posture stiff, ears forward in alertness rather than his usual relaxed demeanor around family. When she moved toward the nursery to peek in on Noah, Duke darted ahead, positioning himself in the doorway. "Duke, move!" Sarah commanded. But the German shepherd held his ground, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "It's fine," Melinda said quickly. "He's just being protective." "I'll check on Noah after you leave." Sarah gathered her teacher's bag and keys, pausing at the door when Duke rushed over, whining and tugging at her skirt with gentle teeth. "Duke, stop! What's gotten into you?" Sarah scolded, gently pushing him away. "Be good for Melinda. I'll see you both this afternoon." As she backed her sedan out of the driveway, she saw Duke's face in the window, barking furiously, paws up on the glass. It was the last clear image she would have before everything shattered. The third-grade classroom was decorated with end-of-year projects when Sarah's cell phone vibrated at 10:17 a.m. Seeing Melinda's name, she excused herself to the hallway. "Sarah!" Melinda's voice was high, hysterical. "You need to come home right now. It's Noah. He's not breathing. I've called 911. The world tilted beneath Sarah's feet. She must have responded somehow, must have told her assistant to watch the class, must have driven home because suddenly she was pulling into her driveway where an ambulance's lights painted everything in rhythmic red pulses. Paramedics were already inside. Duke's barking was frantic, desperate. Sarah pushed through the door to find Melinda sobbing on the couch while 2 EMTs worked over Noah's tiny form on the living room floor. "Ma'am, we need space," one said as she fell to her knees beside them. Noah looked peaceful, as though sleeping, but his lips had a bluish tint that pierced Sarah's heart. Duke was straining against Barbara Jenkins, who had come over during the commotion and somehow managed to hold the agitated dog's collar. "I just found him like that," Melinda sobbed. "I went to check on him after his nap, and he wasn't breathing. I tried CPR, I swear." The next hour passed in a blur. Thomas arrived, his work boots still covered in construction dust. "Doctor?" Eleanor Parker appeared with surprising quickness, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, stethoscope already around her neck, though she wasn't on call at the hospital. "I was in the neighborhood," she explained when Thomas questioned her rapid arrival. "I'm so sorry, but this appears to be SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. It happens even in perfectly healthy babies." "But he was fine this morning," Sarah insisted, her voice hollow. "Completely fine." Duke had been locked in the master bedroom, his howls a soundtrack to their nightmare. When the funeral home attendants arrived to take Noah's body, they had to sedate Duke to keep him from attacking the gurney. Dr. Parker suggested an unusually quick burial. In these summer temperatures with such a small body, decomposition occurs rapidly, she explained clinically. "I'd recommend services within 48 hours. I'll sign the death certificate today." Thomas, numb with shock, agreed. Sarah felt disconnected from her body, as if watching events unfold from somewhere above the room. That evening, as neighbors brought casseroles and sympathy, Barbara Jenkins pulled Sarah aside in the kitchen. "Something doesn't feel right," the older woman murmured, her arthritic hands gripping her cane. "Last night, Around 2 a.m., I saw car lights in your driveway. I thought maybe Thomas had an emergency call from work, but it was a car I didn't recognize. Dark sedan, couldn't see the driver." Sarah barely registered the words. "Barbara, I appreciate your concern, but—" "And Duke," Barbara continued. "That dog isn't grieving, Sarah. He's trying to tell you something. I've been around working dogs my whole life. Harold trained K9S for 20 years. Duke is alerting, not mourning." Thomas entered the kitchen, overhearing the end of the conversation. "Barbara, please. We're dealing with enough right now without adding conspiracies." Barbara's lips thinned. "When my Harold was alive, he always said, 'Trust the dog before you trust the person.' Just remember that." She patted Sarah's hand and made her way slowly to the door. Duke refused to eat that night, pacing the house, sniffing at Noah's empty crib, whining at the door. Melinda had insisted on staying to help, moving into their guest room until they got through this. "It's the least I can do," she said, eyes downcast. "I feel responsible." Sarah noticed Duke watching Melinda intently, tracking her every move with uncharacteristic focus. When Melinda gathered Noah's clothes for the burial outfit, Duke growled until Thomas locked him outside. As Sarah lay sleepless that night, she thought she heard Melinda's voice from the guest room, speaking softly as if on the phone. "Everything's proceeding as planned," Sarah thought she heard. But surely that was grief playing tricks with her mind. The next morning, Richard Atwood from Golden Pines Funeral Home arrived to discuss arrangements. He was a thin man with nervous hands that constantly adjusted his tie. "We can have everything ready by tomorrow afternoon," he assured them, not quite meeting their eyes. "We've prepared the small casket already. White maple, as requested." "That's very fast," Thomas remarked. "We understand the special circumstances," Atwood replied, glancing at the death certificate signed by Dr. Parker. "We want to make this as easy as possible for your family." When Duke managed to slip back inside during Atwood's visit, his reaction was immediate and alarming. He lunged at the funeral director, teeth bared, and would have bitten him if Thomas hadn't intervened. "I'm so sorry," Sarah apologized, pulling Duke away. "He's never like this." Atwood straightened his rumpled jacket. "Grief affects animals strangely. Perhaps it would be best to leave him with a friend during the service." But as Sarah held Duke's collar, feeling his body trembling with tension rather than fear, Barbara's words echoed, "That dog isn't grieving. He's trying to tell you something." The day of the funeral arrived with an oppressive humidity that hung over Lake Michigan like a shroud. Golden Pines Funeral Home stood at the edge of town, a Victorian mansion converted decades earlier into the community's only funeral parlor. Its white columns and manicured lawns seemed to mock the mason's grief with their pristine perfection. Sarah had barely slept, her mind replaying Barbara's words and Duke's behavior in an endless loop. She'd finally decided that Duke needed to be at the funeral, despite Atwood's concerns. "He was as much Noah's family as we are," she'd told Thomas, who hadn't argued. He was moving through their nightmare with mechanical precision, handling arrangements while Sarah drifted through her days like a ghost. They arrived early, Thomas driving while Sarah sat with Duke in the back seat. The German shepherd was unnaturally still, his amber eyes fixed on the building as they approached. Barbara Jenkins had insisted on coming with them rather than waiting for her son to drive her later. "I want to be there for you from the start," she'd said firmly, her weathered face set with determination. Inside, Atwood greeted them with professional solemnity, though his eyes darted nervously to Duke. "We've set up the small chapel as requested. The casket is already in place." "Where's Melinda?" Thomas asked, looking around. "She called to say she'd be a few minutes late," Sarah replied. "Something about picking up flowers." Duke's demeanor changed the moment they entered the chapel. His ears stood at attention, his body stiffened, and a low whine escaped his throat. The small white casket sat on a pedestal at the front, surrounded by modest flower arrangements. Sarah had refused the elaborate displays Melinda had suggested. "It's okay, Duke," Sarah whispered, though she felt a chill at his reaction. "I know this is hard." But Duke wasn't behaving like a dog in mourning. He pulled toward the casket with singular focus, his nails clicking across the polished hardwood floor. When they reached the front row, Sarah felt him trembling against her leg. "Maybe this was a mistake," Thomas murmured, eyeing Duke's agitation. Barbara took Sarah's hand. "Let him approach the casket," she said quietly. "See what he does." Sarah hesitated, then loosened her grip on Duke's leash. The dog moved forward immediately, circling the small coffin, nose working furiously. He sniffed every inch, then looked back at Sarah with what she could only describe as desperation in his eyes. Other mourners began to arrive, colleagues from the school, Thomas's construction crew, neighbors. Melinda slipped in, wearing a black dress that seemed too formal, her eyes darting around the room. When she spotted Duke investigating the coffin, her face paled. "I thought the dog would stay home," she said, her voice strained. "He needed to say goodbye too," Sarah replied, studying Melinda's reaction. As the service began, Duke became increasingly agitated. When Atwood invited Sarah forward to speak, Duke accompanied her, standing rigidly beside her as she tried to find words for the unfathomable loss of her son. It was during her faltering eulogy that Duke suddenly lunged forward, placing his paws on the casket and barking with an urgency that echoed through the small chapel. "Duke, no!" Thomas moved to pull him away, but Duke evaded him, now scratching at the polished wood. Atwood rushed forward. "Please control your animal. This is completely inappropriate." The assembled mourners murmured in shock. Sarah stood frozen, the eulogy forgotten as she watched Duke's desperate attempt to open the casket. When she'd touched it earlier, placing a small toy sailboat atop it, she'd noticed again how light it felt. "Thomas," she whispered, "something's wrong." Barbara struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her cane. "Listen to the dog," she said, her voice carrying in the awkward silence. "In all my 70 years, I've never seen a dog act like this without reason." Melinda was edging toward the door, her phone in hand. "This is disrespectful," she said loudly. "Someone should remove that animal so we can properly say goodbye to Noah." But Duke's behavior had ignited a spark of wild hope in Sarah's chest. She remembered how he had alerted them to Noah's fever months ago before they'd noticed any symptoms. How he'd always seemed to know when Noah was about to cry, positioning himself by the crib seconds before the baby woke. Thomas looked torn, embarrassment and confusion warring on his face. "Sarah, maybe we should open it," she said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "What?" Thomas stared at her. "The casket." "Open it." Sarah moved to Duke's side, placing her hand on his head. The dog immediately calmed at her touch, though he remained vigilant, eyes fixed on the coffin. "Mrs. Mason," Atwood interjected, "that would be highly irregular and frankly disturbing for everyone present. The casket is sealed for a reason." "My son is in there," Sarah said, her voice rising. "If I want to see him one last time, that's my right." Thomas looked between his wife and the funeral director, then at Duke, who had begun to whine again, pawing gently at Sarah's leg, then pointing back to the casket with his nose. "Sarah, are you sure this is what you want?" Thomas asked quietly. It won't change anything." "Thomas," Sarah whispered, gripping his hand, "I need you to trust me. Something isn't right. Duke knows it. I can feel it. Please." The room had gone completely silent. Barbara stood beside Sarah, her arthritic hand resting supportively on the younger woman's shoulder. "Trust your instincts, girl," she murmured. "A mother knows." Melinda's voice cut through the tension. "This is absurd. You're letting grief make you crazy, listening to a dog instead of professionals. Noah deserves better than this circus." The harshness in her tone made Thomas straighten, something hardening in his expression. "Mr. Atwood," he said firmly, "please open the casket." Atwood looked as though he might faint. "I strongly advise against—" "Now," Thomas said, stepping forward. "Or I'll do it myself." The funeral director glanced toward the door where Melinda stood, something unspoken passing between them. Then, with trembling hands, he moved to unlock the casket's simple brass fixtures. "This is highly irregular," he repeated, sweat beading on his forehead. "I must insist that most guests step outside for this moment." Several people quietly left, but Barbara, Thomas, and Sarah remained, along with Barbara's son Michael, who had arrived in his police uniform, and two of Thomas's closest friends from the construction company. Duke stood at attention, ears forward, body coiled with tension, as Atwood slowly raised the casket lid. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The lid rose, revealing not Noah's peaceful face, but a weighted doll wearing Noah's blue sailboat sleeper and wrapped in his favorite blanket. Sarah's scream shattered the silence. Thomas stumbled backward as if physically struck, Atwood's face drained of all color, and Melinda bolted for the door, only to be caught by Michael Jenkins, who had moved with the quick reflexes of his police training to block her escape. "Where is my son?" Sarah's voice rose to a primal howl, her hands clutching the doll that had been meant to replace her child. "Where is Noah?" Chaos erupted in the small chapel. Sarah collapsed to her knees, still clutching the weighted doll dressed in Noah's clothes. Thomas moved with unexpected speed, crossing the room to where Michael Jenkins restrained Melinda, his face contorted with rage and fear. "Where is my son?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "What have you done with Noah?" Duke barked frantically, circling the empty casket, then rushing to Sarah as if trying to communicate something vital. The German shepherd kept moving between Sarah and the door, his intent clear to Barbara, who watched through tears. "He wants to find Noah," the elderly woman said. "He knows something." Michael had already radioed for backup, maintaining a professional grip on Melinda despite his own shock. "Ma'am, you're being detained for questioning regarding a potential kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent." "You don't understand," Melinda cried, struggling against his hold. "Noah is safe. He's better off where he is now." Those words sent a fresh wave of horror through Sarah. She stood shakily, still clutching the doll. "He's alive? My baby is alive?" Her voice trembled between desperation and fragile hope. Richard Atwood attempted to slip away during the commotion, but Thomas's friend Jake, a burly construction foreman, blocked his path. "You ain't going nowhere, buddy. You got some explaining to do." Within minutes, police officers flooded the funeral home. The shocked mourners were interviewed in separate rooms while crime scene technicians photographed the casket and doll. Sarah sat in a daze, Duke's head resting protectively on her lap, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mrs. Mason," a detective named Reynolds said gently, "we need to ask you some questions about Melinda Walker. How long has she worked for you?" 2 months, Sarah whispered. "She came through Perfect Care Agency. They said she was experienced with infants." "Had all the right references." Detective Reynolds nodded, making notes. "And Dr. Parker? How long has she been your pediatrician?" "She's not," Thomas interjected. "Our regular doctor is on sabbatical. Parker was covering, said she was from the same practice. She just appeared when Noah—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Barbara, who had refused to leave Sarah's side despite her son's professional concerns, spoke up. "That woman showed up too fast when they called 911. I was there within minutes of the ambulance, and she arrived right after, claiming she was in the neighborhood. No doctor responds that quickly to a call about a deceased child." The detective's eyebrows rose. Dr. Eleanor Parker is currently being sought for questioning. She's not at her office or home, and we're discovering some irregularities in her credentials. What about Noah? Sarah pleaded. Every minute we waste. We have officers questioning both Melinda Walker and Richard Atwood, Reynolds assured her, and we've put out an Amber Alert with Noah's description. Duke whined and pawed at Sarah's leg, then moved toward the door again. He's been doing that since we found the doll, Sarah explained. It's like he's trying to lead me somewhere. Barbara nodded firmly. That dog knows something. My Harold trained police dogs for 20 years. Duke's trying to track. The detective looked skeptical, but desperate parents and a potential lead were enough to make him consider it. Does Duke have any items that belong to Noah? Something with his scent. Thomas hurried to their car, returning with Noah's favorite stuffed lamb. Duke immediately perked up, sniffing the toy eagerly. We have K9 units en route, Reynolds said, but they'll need time to get a scent. If Duke has a connection to your son, it might be worth seeing what he's trying to tell you. Sarah knelt before Duke, holding his face between her hands. Find Noah, she whispered. Find our baby. The German shepherd seemed to understand, taking the lamb gently in his mouth and heading determinedly toward the door. While one team of detectives worked to unravel the conspiracy at the funeral home, Sarah, Thomas, and 2 officers followed Duke as he led them on a winding path through town. He moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to reconfirm the scent, but always pressing forward with increasing urgency. He's taking us toward the lake, Thomas realized as they turned onto Shoreline Drive. Duke led them past the public beach, down a private access road to a cluster of summer homes that stood mostly vacant this early in the season. At the last house on the peninsula, a weathered gray Victorian with peeling paint, Duke stopped, hackles raised, a growl rumbling in his throat. That's Westmoreland Point, one officer said. The old Edwards place. Been vacant for years, since the bank foreclosed. Duke circled the house, sniffing intently, then returned to the front door, barking insistently. Through a side window, they could see a light on in what might be the kitchen. Someone's in there, Thomas whispered. The officers drew their weapons. Stay back, one instructed, using his radio to request backup. But Sarah had spotted something that made her heart stop. A flash of blue fabric in an upstairs window, the same shade as Noah's favorite blanket. My son is in there, she said, a mother's certainty in her voice. Duke grew increasingly frantic, his barking more urgent as he clawed at the front door. We need to wait for backup, the officer insisted, but the sound of a car engine starting at the rear of the property made the decision for them. Someone's leaving, Thomas shouted, already running toward the back. The officers had no choice but to act. Police, open up, one shouted, pounding on the door. The door swung open to reveal Dr. Eleanor Parker, her silver hair now loose around her shoulders, her professional demeanor replaced by cold calculation. You have no warrant, she said calmly. Duke lunged forward, slipping past the doctor's legs before anyone could stop him. His barking led them upstairs, where they found a room set up as a nursery, not the modest, practical nursery of the Masons' home, but an elaborate space filled with expensive toys, a hand-carved crib, and imported furniture. And there, lying in the ornate crib, was Noah, alive but unresponsive, an IV drip attached to his tiny arm. Noah! Sarah rushed to her son, gathering him carefully into her arms, mindful of the IV. What have you done to him? She demanded of Parker. Nothing harmful, the doctor replied with clinical detachment. Just a mild sedative to keep him comfortable during the transition. He'll wake soon. Duke positioned himself protectively beside the crib, growling at Parker when she moved. The new parents will be very disappointed, Parker said, as if discussing a delayed delivery rather than a kidnapped child. They paid a substantial premium for a healthy American infant with no family complications. The officer handcuffed Parker as Thomas checked Noah's vital signs with trembling hands. "He's breathing normally," he said, relief washing over his face. "His pulse is steady." The second officer returned breathless. "Car got away, but I got the plate." "County units are in pursuit." Sarah cradled Noah, tears streaming down her face as Duke pressed against her leg, his mission accomplished. "You found him," she whispered to the dog. "You saved our baby." Barbara's words echoed in her mind. "Trust the dog before you trust the person." At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Noah was in stable condition, the sedatives already wearing off. The reunited family waited anxiously in a private room. Duke permitted inside as a special exception after the hospital administrator heard the remarkable story. Detective Reynolds arrived with grim news. "We've uncovered an international adoption fraud ring," he explained. "Dr. Parker has been falsifying death certificates for infants who are then sold to wealthy foreign buyers. Melinda Walker was placed in your home specifically to identify Noah as a potential target." "But why Noah?" Thomas asked, his arm protectively around Sarah as she held their sleeping son. "His rare blood type," Reynolds replied. "Apparently there's a wealthy couple in Europe with a child needing a bone marrow donor with that exact profile. They were willing to pay $500,000. Sarah felt physically ill. They were going to use him for harvesting? "We believe so," Reynolds confirmed. "Parker admitted they've done this before. Take a healthy child, fake their death, then sell them either for adoption or other purposes." Thomas's face hardened. "And Atwood? The funeral home?" "Central to the operation. The perfect cover. Who questions a sealed casket? Who would think to verify the body is actually inside? We've found evidence of at least 7 other cases." Sarah looked down at Noah, now stirring in her arms, and then at Duke, who hadn't left their side since the rescue. If Duke hadn't been so persistent. "We've caught Parker and Atwood," Reynolds said. "Melinda's cooperating, claiming she didn't know about the medical harvesting angle. The driver who fled the lake house is still at large, along with several international contacts." As the detective left, Barbara Jenkins hobbled into the room, her face lighting up at the sight of Noah. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said, gently touching the baby's cheek. "Sometimes through 4 paws and a wet nose." Duke rested his head on the hospital bed, amber eyes fixed on Noah with the unwavering devotion that had saved his life. Sarah realized they would never know all the details of Duke's past. What training he'd received, why he'd been surrendered to the shelter. But his instincts and loyalty had brought their son back to them when all human systems had failed. The hospital room filled with the soft beeps of monitoring equipment as Noah slept peacefully in the pediatric bed. Despite doctors' reassurances that he would recover completely, Sarah hadn't let go of his tiny hand since they'd been admitted. Thomas alternated between pacing the room and making urgent phone calls, his face tight with a mixture of relief and lingering anger. Duke lay vigilantly at the foot of the bed, his amber eyes tracking every movement in the room, particularly whenever medical staff entered to check Noah's vital signs. Outside the window, dark clouds gathered over Lake Michigan. The Weather Service had issued storm warnings, predicting one of the worst summer systems in years would hit the shoreline by evening. But inside their protected bubble, the Masons focused solely on their son's steady breathing and the miracle of his return. "The sedative is clearing his system normally," Doc Whitaker, the hospital's chief pediatrician, explained during his late afternoon rounds. "His blood work shows no concerning abnormalities, though we'd like to monitor him overnight as a precaution." Sarah nodded, unable to form words through the lump in her throat. Thomas asked the questions she couldn't. "Any lasting effects? Trauma?" Dr. Whitaker's kind eyes softened. "Physically, I believe he'll recover completely. Emotionally." He shrugged slightly. "Infants are remarkably resilient. The fact that he recognized you immediately upon waking is an excellent sign." It was true. When Noah had finally opened his eyes an hour after their arrival at the hospital, his first response had been to reach for Sarah with a familiar babble, as if the nightmare had never happened. Only his unusual clinginess suggested any memory of the ordeal. Detective Reynolds returned as evening approached, accompanied by his partner, a stern-faced woman who introduced herself as Detective Morales. They carried notebooks and grim expressions. "We have more information," Reynolds began, glancing at Noah to confirm he was asleep. "Dr. Parker is talking, hoping for leniency. The operation is larger than we initially thought." "How many children?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. "At least 23 over the past 4 years that we can confirm," Morales replied, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Most were sold for adoption to wealthy families overseas, but 7, including Noah, were selected for medical purposes." Sarah's grip on Noah's hand tightened. "Because of his blood type?" Reynolds nodded. "Parker admits they targeted your family specifically. They monitor birth records for rare blood types and genetic markers, then place operatives like Melinda to evaluate the family situation." "Evaluate?" Thomas's voice rose before he caught himself, glancing at Noah. "They look for families under financial pressure," Morales explained. "Your mortgage troubles, Thomas losing his executive position, these made you vulnerable in their eyes. They assumed you'd be less likely to question a sudden tragedy, more likely to accept quick burial arrangements." The calculated cruelty stole Sarah's breath. "They watched us, studied us." "Melinda provided weekly reports," Reynolds confirmed. "The decision to move forward came when Thomas mentioned you might need to sell the house." Duke lifted his head at the tension in the room, moving closer to Noah's bed. "What will happen to them?" Sarah asked. "Parker and Atwood will face federal charges, kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy," Reynolds explained. "Melinda's cooperating, so her sentencing may be reduced, though she'll serve significant time." "And the others?" Thomas pressed. "The people who were going to use our son?" Morales's expression hardened. "We're working with Interpol." "The European couple claims they didn't know the children were kidnapped, believe they were legitimate adoptions, but we're investigating. The network facilitators are our primary targets." A nurse entered to check Noah's IV, and the detectives stepped outside to continue their discussion with Thomas. Sarah remained at Noah's side, processing the nightmare's scope. Duke whined softly, placing his head on the bed beside her hand. "You knew," she whispered to the German shepherd. "Somehow, you knew." The storm hit with full force as darkness fell. Rain lashed the hospital windows while thunder rattled the building's foundations. The power flickered once, twice, then stabilized as the backup generators engaged. Barbara Jenkins had returned home reluctantly at her son's insistence, but called hourly for updates. During one call, she shared what she'd learned from a former K-9 officer friend. "I showed him Duke's picture," she told Sarah. "He recognized him immediately, said Duke was one of their most promising trainees for search and rescue, especially for finding children, but he washed out of the program." "Why?" Sarah asked, stroking Duke's head as he lay beside Noah's bed. "Too protective once he found the children," Barbara explained. "Most search dogs alert and move on, but Duke wouldn't leave the children he found, refused to abandon them even when handlers ordered him to. They considered it a fault." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "A fault that saved Noah's life." The hospital staff made an unprecedented exception to allow Duke to remain overnight, touched by the story spreading through the medical center. A young orderly even snuck in a premium dog bed and bowl of water, though Duke refused to leave his position beside Noah. Shortly after midnight, as Thomas dozed in a chair and Sarah fought to keep her eyes open, Noah's monitors began to alarm. His oxygen levels dropped suddenly, his small body going rigid in a seizure. "Code Blue, Pediatrics!" The room filled instantly with medical personnel. "It's the after effects of the sedative," one doctor explained as they stabilized Noah. "Some children can have delayed reactions. We need to move him to intensive care." As they prepared to transport Noah, a power surge from the storm plunged the hospital into darkness. The emergency lights came on, but the elevator systems reset. "We'll have to take the stairs," a nurse said urgently. "3 floors up." They transferred Noah to a portable gurney, his tiny form connected to portable monitors. Duke followed anxiously as they navigated the dim, emergency-lit hallways toward the stairwell. The backup generator should have maintained power to critical systems, but something had gone wrong. Radio calls revealed flooding in the basement had compromised the electrical systems. "The main pharmacy storage is on the 3rd floor," Dr. Whitaker told Thomas and Sarah as they hurried alongside Noah's gurney. "We need medication from there to counter the seizure activity." At the stairwell, Duke suddenly froze, hackles raised, growling toward the emergency exit at the corridor's end. A shadow moved there, a figure slipping through the door. "Someone's following us," Sarah whispered, clutching Thomas's arm. One of the security guards accompanying them moved to investigate while the medical team continued up the stairs with Noah. Duke hesitated, torn between following his boy and investigating the threat. "Go with Noah," Sarah urged the dog. "Stay with him." Duke bounded up the stairs ahead of the gurney, leading the way through the darkened stairwell as if guiding them. When they reached the 3rd floor, they found the pediatric ICU in darkness, staff working by flashlight. "The meds we need are in the secure storage," a nurse explained, fumbling with a ring of keys. As they approached the pharmacy storage room, Duke suddenly growled, planting himself in front of Sarah and Thomas. Around the corner came a man in hospital scrubs, but his wet shoes and lack of identification badge instantly triggered alarms. It was the driver who had escaped from the lake house. "Sir, you need to identify yourself," a security guard called, moving forward. The man turned to flee, but Duke launched himself down the hallway, a blur of determined muscle and fur. He caught the intruder's arm in powerful jaws, bringing him down with precision that spoke to professional training. Security subdued the man, who eventually identified himself as Klaus Werner, the international facilitator of Parker's operation. He had come to eliminate evidence, and possibly Noah himself, when he learned the ring had been exposed. "He would have found a way in eventually," Detective Morales said later when police arrived to take Werner into custody. "These people don't leave loose ends." Sarah looked at Duke, who had returned to Noah's side once Werner was subdued. But they didn't count on him. By morning, the storm had passed, Noah's condition had stabilized, and sunlight streamed through the hospital windows. The seizures had stopped, and doctors were cautiously optimistic about a full recovery with no lasting effects. Barbara Jenkins arrived early, bearing homemade cookies for the nurses and premium dog treats for Duke. "The whole town's talking about him," she said, watching Duke accept a treat without moving from his position beside Noah. "Our hero dog." Thomas, who had spent the night making calls to secure their home and arrange for additional security, finally allowed himself to relax slightly. "I don't know what we would have done without him." "You wouldn't have had to do anything," Sarah said softly, the horror of that alternative reality washing over her. "We would have buried an empty coffin and never known Noah was out there somewhere, being—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Duke whined softly, pressing his head against her hand as if sensing her distress. A commotion in the hallway announced the arrival of news crews, eager to document the miraculous rescue. Hospital administration had been fielding calls since dawn, the story having spread throughout the Midwest overnight. "We don't have to talk to them," Thomas assured Sarah, protective as always. But Sarah surprised him. "I think we should. People need to know this can happen, that you can't always trust the authorities, that sometimes—" She scratched behind Duke's ears. Sometimes you have to listen to different kinds of wisdom. As the sun climbed higher over Lake Michigan, painting the hospital room in golden morning light, Noah finally opened his eyes. His first reaction was to smile at his parents, then reach toward Duke with chubby fingers. The German shepherd moved carefully closer, allowing the baby to grab his fur. "Da!" Noah exclaimed, his first clear attempt at a word. "Did he just—" Thomas stared in wonder. "Duke," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "He said Duke—" The day after Noah's rescue brought the full weight of tragedy and miracle into sharp focus for the Mason family. While Noah's condition steadily improved under constant medical supervision, Sarah and Thomas received devastating updates about the extent of the criminal operation that had nearly stolen their son forever. Detective Reynolds arrived mid-morning with a thick folder and grim expression. "We've identified 22 other families targeted by this ring over the past 4 years," he explained, keeping his voice low as Noah napped in the hospital crib. 17 children were sold to wealthy foreign couples who claimed they believed the adoptions were legitimate. 5 others— His voice faltered. 5 others were selected for medical purposes like Noah. "Were they recovered?" Thomas asked, his arm protectively around Sarah's shoulders. Reynolds shook his head slowly. 2 were found deceased after the procedures were completed. 1 is still missing, presumed to be overseas. The other 2 were recovered alive, but with significant medical complications from partial organ harvesting. Sarah's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair beside Noah's bed. The horror of what might have happened to their son crashed over her like a physical blow. Duke immediately moved to her side, pressing his warm body against her legs in silent comfort. "If Duke hadn't—" she began, unable to complete the thought. "You were the first to discover the truth before the procedure," Reynolds confirmed. "The others believed their children had died from SIDS or other natural causes. They actually buried empty caskets, just like you almost did." Thomas paced the small room, fury radiating from his tense shoulders. How could this happen? How could so many professionals be involved? Doctors, funeral directors, nannies, people we're supposed to trust. "Money," Reynolds said simply. Parker was paid over $100,000 per child. Atwood received $50,000 for each false burial. The transporters, the overseas facilitators, everyone got a cut of what wealthy clients would pay for a healthy American infant, especially one with rare medical compatibility. "And Melinda?" Sarah asked, remembering the young woman who had cooed over Noah, who had fed him and changed him while planning his abduction. "That's where it gets complicated," Reynolds said, flipping open the folder. "Melinda Walker isn't her real name. She's actually Jennifer Carson, and she entered the organization 3 years ago after her own infant son died of actual SIDS." Sarah's head snapped up. "What?" "She suffered severe postpartum depression, was briefly hospitalized. When she was released, she was approached by Parker, who recognized her vulnerability. She started as an office assistant, then became one of their scouts, identifying potential targets." The twisted psychology stunned them both into silence. A grieving mother helping to inflict that same grief on others, even if falsely. "She's cooperating fully," Reynolds added. "Says watching you with Noah made her increasingly uncomfortable with the operation. She claimed she was going to back out before the abduction but was threatened by Parker and Werner." Thomas made a dismissive sound. "Convenient for her to say now." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Whitaker entered with Noah's latest test results, his expression cautiously optimistic. "The good news is that all the sedatives are out of his system, and we're seeing no signs of lasting effects from the seizure. If he continues to improve today, you can take him home tomorrow." Home. The word hung in the air, both comforting and complicated. Their house now felt tainted by Melinda's presence, by the terrible morning when they thought Noah had died in his crib. "We can't go back there," Sarah said quietly to Thomas after the doctor left. "Not right away." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. "My sister called. She's offered her lake cabin up north. It's remote, secure. We can stay there while we figure things out." Duke's ears perked up at the change in their tone, his intelligent eyes moving between them. "He comes too, of course," Thomas added, reaching down to scratch behind the German shepherd's ears. "He's family. More than family after what he did." The truth was, none of them could imagine being separated from Duke now. The bond that had always been strong had transformed into something sacred, forged in the crucible of near tragedy and miraculous rescue. As afternoon stretched into evening, the hospital corridor outside Noah's room filled with a steady stream of visitors. Barbara Jenkins returned with her church quilting circle, bearing a handmade baby quilt with Duke's silhouette stitched into one corner. Thomas's construction crew arrived with a hand-carved wooden plaque featuring a German shepherd standing guard over a sleeping child. Sarah's fellow teachers brought children's books and a donation collection they'd taken up to help with medical expenses. The outpouring of community support overwhelmed the exhausted parents. Even more surprising were the calls and emails from across the country as the story spread through national news. German shepherd rescue organizations, child advocacy groups, and ordinary citizens touched by their ordeal reached out with messages of support and offers of assistance. "You've struck a chord," Barbara told them, her weathered hands gentle as she stroked Noah's cheek. "People need to believe in miracles sometimes. And they need to be reminded to trust their instincts, especially when it comes to protecting children." Noah was blissfully unaware of his newfound celebrity, content to play with the stuffed animals that now overflowed his hospital crib. His only concern seemed to be maintaining visual contact with Duke, fussing whenever the dog moved out of his sight. "Duke," he said, clearly, several times, confirming that his first word had indeed been the name of his protector. "Harold would say that's exactly right," Barbara nodded approvingly. In the old days, people understood that the bond between a child and their guardian animal was sacred. These modern folks with their technology and their fancy degrees have forgotten the old wisdom. As night fell, Sarah found herself alone with Noah and Duke while Thomas stepped out to make arrangements for their departure the next day. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and Noah's occasional babble as he drifted toward sleep. Sarah sat in the chair beside his crib, watching her son's eyelids grow heavy. "I almost lost you," she whispered, more to herself than to Noah. "I believed them. I was going to bury an empty coffin and never know you were out there somewhere, needing me." Duke whined softly, pressing his head against her knee as if understanding her words. Sarah stroked his fur, feeling its coarse texture beneath her fingers, anchoring her to the present moment. "How did you know?" she asked the dog. "What did you sense that none of us could?" Duke's amber eyes held hers steadily, full of an intelligence she had always recognized but never fully appreciated until now. She remembered how he had tried to block Melinda from Noah's room that last morning, how he had scratched frantically at their bedroom door the night before, trying to warn them. "I'll never doubt you again," she promised him. "Never." A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Detective Morales stood in the doorway, her usual stern expression softened by what appeared to be genuine emotion. "May I come in?" she asked quietly, mindful of Noah's near-sleep state. Sarah nodded, and the detective entered, carrying a manila envelope. "We found something in Werner's possessions that you should see," Morales explained, pulling out several photographs. "These were taken of your family over the past 2 months." Sarah's skin crawled as she looked through surveillance photos. Thomas leaving for work, Sarah teaching in her classroom, Noah being pushed in his stroller by Melinda. But it was the photos of Duke that caught her attention. Multiple shots showed the German Shepherd watching Melinda intently, positioning himself between her and Noah or staring suspiciously at visitors to the house. They were documenting Duke as a potential problem, Morales explained. Werner's notes mentioned that the dog seemed unusually protective and aware. They were actually considering poisoning him before proceeding with Noah's abduction. A cold shiver ran through Sarah at how close they had come to losing both Noah and Duke. "Why are you showing me these?" she asked, handing back the disturbing images. "Because I've been in law enforcement for 26 years, Morales said, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "And I've never seen anything like this, a dog so clearly aware of danger that wasn't yet evident to anyone else. My partner thinks I'm being sentimental, but I believe you should know just how remarkable your dog truly is." As Morales left, Sarah turned back to Duke, who had settled on the floor beside Noah's crib in his now familiar protective position. His loyalty and intuition had saved their son when all human systems had failed, medical, legal, even parental. "Guardian angel with fur," she whispered, remembering Barbara's words. The truth spread like wildfire. What began as a local news story exploded into national headlines. Dog saves infant from international kidnapping ring. Canine hero exposes medical trafficking network. When doctors lie, the German Shepherd who knew better. Within days, the Masons' ordeal had captivated the country, tapping into primal fears of lost children and the corruption of trusted institutions. On the morning Noah was discharged from the hospital, Thomas had to navigate their car through a crowd of reporters and well-wishers. Duke sat protectively in the back seat next to Noah's car seat, his body positioned to shield the baby from the pressing cameras and shouting voices. "Mr. Mason, how did Duke know your son wasn't really dead? Mrs. Mason, will you be suing the funeral home? Can we get a picture of the hero dog?" Sarah kept her head down, focusing only on getting Noah safely into the car. The media frenzy was overwhelming, but not as disturbing as the flood of messages from conspiracy theorists, grieving parents questioning their own children's deaths, and desperate people seeking verification that other lost loved ones might still be alive. "We're not going home," Thomas reminded her as they finally broke free of the crowd. "Straight to my sister's cabin. The police are escorting us part of the way." The unmarked police car following them provided some comfort as they left the hospital behind, heading north toward the more remote reaches of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Noah, blissfully unaware of the chaos, dozed in his car seat while Duke maintained his vigilant watch, occasionally licking the baby's hand when he stirred. Detective Reynolds had briefed them that morning on the expanding investigation. "We've identified connections to similar operations in 5 other states," he'd explained. "The FBI has taken over as lead agency. Parker and Atwood are facing multiple federal charges, and with Werner in custody, we're making progress on the international connections." "What about the other children?" Sarah had asked, the fate of the other victims weighing heavily on her mind. "2 have been recovered alive from overseas locations," Reynolds had confirmed. 3 others. He hadn't needed to finish the sentence. The grim reality of what they had narrowly escaped hung between them. As they drove through the dappled sunlight of the northern forests, Sarah felt the crushing weight of survivors' guilt. Why had they been the lucky ones? Why had Noah been spared when other parents' children weren't? The answer dozed beside her, his fur catching the sun. Duke, their extraordinary protector, who had recognized a threat no human had detected. "I keep thinking about the other families," she said softly to Thomas. "The ones who really did bury empty coffins and never knew." Thomas nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Reynolds said they're reopening cases of Sid's deaths, where Parker was the certifying physician. There could be more." The implications were too horrible to fully contemplate. Grieving parents who might now learn their children hadn't died naturally but had been stolen and sold. Or worse, parents who would discover their children had indeed been taken but couldn't be recovered. Sarah wasn't sure which was more cruel. "We need to do something for them," she said suddenly. "When this is all over, something to help them find closure or justice or something." Thomas reached over to squeeze her hand. "We will, I promise." The cabin sat on the shores of a small inland lake, surrounded by thick pine forest and accessible only by a winding dirt road. Thomas's sister, Elaine, had stocked the refrigerator and pantry before discreetly withdrawing to give them privacy. A handwritten note on the kitchen table read simply, "Take all the time you need. Call if you need anything at all. Love, L." Duke did a thorough inspection of the property before seeming to relax, apparently satisfied that no threats lurked in the surrounding woods. For the first time in days, his posture loosened, though he still checked Noah's location frequently. The simple cabin became their sanctuary. With no internet connection and limited cell service, they were finally sheltered from the media storm. Days fell into a peaceful rhythm. Mornings on the small deck watching the mist rise from the lake, afternoons napping with Noah in the cool interior, evenings by the fire pit as stars emerged overhead. But peace didn't mean healing had begun. Sarah still startled awake multiple times each night to check that Noah was breathing. Thomas installed extra locks on doors and windows, standing guard with a baseball bat at the slightest unusual sound. And Duke continued his vigil, sleeping only in short bursts, always positioned between potential entry points and Noah's portable crib. On their fourth night at the cabin, Sarah found Thomas sitting alone on the dock, staring out at the moonlit water. She joined him silently, their feet dangling just above the gentle, lapping waves. "I failed him," Thomas said finally, his voice rough. "Failed you both. I'm supposed to protect my family, and I didn't see what was happening right under our roof." Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "None of us saw it. Even the police didn't suspect anything until Duke showed us." "That's just it," Thomas replied, anger and shame threading through his words. "A dog figured it out before I did. What kind of father does that make me?" "The kind who trusted medical professionals and systems that are supposed to be trustworthy," Sarah said firmly. "We all did. That's not failure, Thomas. That's being human in a world where we have to rely on experts sometimes." Thomas wasn't ready to forgive himself. "I dismissed Barbara's concerns. I got annoyed with Duke for barking and scratching. I was so busy trying to provide financially that I missed what really mattered, keeping my son safe." Sarah had no easy answers. She'd been replaying her own actions just as critically, leaving Noah with Melinda despite Duke's obvious distrust, focusing on her teaching job when she should have been more present, accepting Dr. Parker's SIDS diagnosis without questioning. The guilt was a shared burden, heavy and jagged between them. From inside the cabin came Noah's cry, followed immediately by Duke's alert bark. They both rushed back inside to find the baby standing in his portable crib, little hands gripping the mesh sides. Duke circled the crib, tail wagging now that the parents had responded. As Sarah lifted Noah into her arms, she caught Thomas watching Duke with a new expression, not just gratitude but a profound respect. "You know," Thomas said slowly, "my grandfather used to say that animals see things we don't, not just with their senses, but with something deeper. I always thought it was superstitious nonsense." "And now?" Sarah asked, bouncing Noah gently as he settled against her shoulder. "Now I think we've forgotten something important by trusting machines and experts over instincts and natural wisdom." He knelt to ruffle Duke's fur. "This old boy knew. He just knew." A week into their retreat, Detective Reynolds called with news that shattered their fragile peace. The driver of the dark sedan Barbara had spotted at their house the night before Noah's death had been identified as Oliver Kemp, a medical transport specialist connected to Werner's operation. But more disturbingly, he was still at large. "We have reason to believe he may try to find Noah, Reynolds explained, his voice crackling through the poor connection. "Not to harm him. The clients still want him. They've already paid half the money." Sarah clutched Noah tighter as Thomas paced the small living room. "How could they possibly find us here?" "They probably can't," Reynolds reassured them. "But I'm sending officers to check on you tomorrow just as a precaution." "And Thomas, your sister called us concerned about someone asking questions about the cabin in town. Probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." After the call, they double-checked every lock, drew all the curtains, and moved Noah's crib into the main bedroom. Duke seemed to sense their renewed fear, positioning himself at the bedroom door all night, alert to every sound from the surrounding forest. Neither Sarah nor Thomas slept. Every creaking branch, every calling owl became a potential threat in the darkness. The cabin that had felt like sanctuary now seemed exposed and vulnerable, too far from help if something happened. "We should leave at first light," Thomas whispered around 3 a.m. "Go somewhere they wouldn't expect. Maybe my brother's place in Arizona." "Running won't solve this," Sarah replied, equally quiet. "These people have resources, connections. We need to end this, not just hide from it." Thomas sat up in the darkness. "What are you suggesting?" Sarah had been thinking about it since Reynolds' call. "What if we let them think they've found us, set a trap with the police?" The silence stretched between them, broken only by Noah's soft breathing and Duke's occasional snuffling at the door. "It's too dangerous," Thomas finally said. "I won't use our son as bait." "Not Noah," Sarah clarified. "Me, with a doll, like they used. Let them think I'm alone with Noah, vulnerable. Draw them out so the police can catch them." Before Thomas could respond, Duke suddenly stood at attention, a low growl rumbling in his throat. His focus was on the bedroom window, ears forward, hackles raised. Thomas grabbed the baseball bat from beside the bed while Sarah gathered Noah into her arms. Duke's growl deepened, and they heard it then. The soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. The sound of footsteps circling the cabin froze everyone in place. Sarah clutched Noah to her chest, muffling his startled whimper against her shoulder. Thomas motioned for absolute silence, his knuckles white around the baseball bat. Duke's growl deepened, the sound barely audible but vibrating through his entire body as he positioned himself between the window and his family. Thomas reached for his cell phone on the nightstand, but the screen showed no service. The spotty reception in these remote woods had finally failed completely. Their only landline was in the kitchen, impossibly far away through the dark cabin. Sarah pointed toward the closet, mouthing, "Hide." Thomas nodded, helping her and Noah inside before pulling the door nearly closed. Through the narrow opening, Sarah watched as he and Duke crept toward the bedroom door. The footsteps stopped directly beneath their window. A beam of light swept across the curtains, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone testing the window lock. Duke's growl intensified, and Thomas placed a restraining hand on his collar, recognizing that the intruder might flee if alerted too soon. Noah stirred against Sarah's chest, sensing her tension. She pressed her lips to his forehead, silently praying he wouldn't cry out. Inside the closet, surrounded by Thomas's sister's winter coats, Sarah felt her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the cabin. A distinct metallic scraping sound came from the window, someone trying to force the lock. Thomas released Duke's collar and whispered, "Go." The German shepherd erupted in a thunderous barking that shattered the night's silence. Thomas simultaneously flipped on the bedroom light and shouted, "We've called the police! They're on their way!" The flashlight beam disappeared instantly. Through the window they could see a dark figure sprinting toward the trees. Thomas rushed to the front door, baseball bat still in hand, just in time to see headlights flare to life on the dirt access road, a vehicle accelerating away into the darkness. "Stay in the closet," he called to Sarah as he fumbled with the landline in the kitchen. I'm calling Reynolds. Sarah emerged cautiously, still holding Noah, who had miraculously remained quiet throughout the ordeal. Duke circled back to them, pressing against Sarah's legs as if to reassure her while still maintaining his alert posture. "The police are 30 minutes out," Thomas reported grimly after making the call. "Reynolds says to pack essentials. We're not staying here tonight." They moved with the efficiency of terror, throwing clothes and supplies into bags while Duke patrolled the perimeter of the room, occasionally growling toward the windows. Noah, sensing the disruption to routine, began to fuss. "How did they find us?" Sarah whispered as she packed Noah's formula and diapers. Thomas shook his head. "Reynolds said they picked up chatter on Werner's associates' phones. They know Noah survived. They've been looking for us since we left the hospital." The realization that they'd never been truly safe, that their pursuers had methodically tracked them to this remote location, struck Sarah like a physical blow. "They won't stop, will they?" "Not until they're caught," Thomas confirmed, zipping up the last bag. "But we're not going to hide anymore. Reynolds has a safe house ready with round-the-clock protection, and they're setting up an operation to catch these people." Sarah nodded, remembering her earlier suggestion about setting a trap. It no longer seemed like a desperate idea, but the only way to end this nightmare permanently. Headlights swept across the cabin again, causing both of them to freeze. Duke rushed to the front door, his bark changing from aggressive to welcoming as a car door slammed. "Police, Mr. and Mrs. Mason?" Relief flooded through Sarah as two uniformed officers approached the cabin, followed by Detective Reynolds himself. "We got lucky," Reynolds explained as they hurriedly loaded their belongings into the police cruiser. "Had a unit returning from another call nearby. The perimeter team is searching the woods, but I doubt they'll find anything. These people are professionals." As they drove away from the cabin, Sarah looked back at the small structure that had briefly been their sanctuary. Duke sat beside her in the back seat, his body still on alert, amber eyes scanning the dark forests as they passed. "They're getting desperate," Reynolds said from the front passenger seat. "Which means they're more dangerous, but also more likely to make mistakes. We've frozen most of their accounts based on Werner's information. Their clients are demanding refunds or delivery. They can't just walk away at this point. So we're bait," Thomas said flatly. "No," Reynolds corrected. "You're the witnesses who can bring down their entire operation. The safe house is completely secure, former government property with every imaginable security feature. You'll be safe there while we set our trap." Sarah met Thomas's eyes across Noah's car seat. The same understanding passed between them. There would be no true safety, no return to normal life, until this threat was eliminated completely. The safe house turned out to be a renovated Cold War-era communications bunker disguised as an ordinary farmhouse, surrounded by open fields that made approach impossible without detection, staffed with armed officers and equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance. It represented the exact opposite of the vulnerable cabin in the woods. "Nobody gets in or out without passing through 3 checkpoints," Reynolds assured them as they settled into the surprisingly comfortable interior. "You can breathe easy here." But breathing easy proved impossible. The immediate danger might have been contained, but the psychological damage had been done. Sarah jumped at every sound. Thomas checked and rechecked the locks. Duke refused to relax his vigilance, particularly when Noah was sleeping. 3 days into their stay, Reynolds arrived with FBI Special Agent Monica Harding, the lead investigator now that the case had expanded to include multiple states and international connections. "We've identified Oliver Kemp's network," Harding explained, spreading photos across the kitchen table. 5 primary operatives still active in the Midwest, all with medical or transportation backgrounds, all connected to Werner's operation. "And they're still trying to find Noah?" Thomas asked. Harding nodded grimly. "The clients, a wealthy European couple, paid $500,000 up front for a child with Noah's specific blood type. Their daughter needs ongoing transfusions, and potentially bone marrow. They claim they thought it was a legitimate adoption, but our European counterparts are investigating whether they knew the true nature of the transaction. Sarah felt physically ill. They wanted to use him like a medical supply. Unfortunately, yes. And since they've already invested significant money, they're pressing their contacts to complete the delivery, Harding confirmed, which gives us an opportunity to catch everyone involved. The plan they outlined was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Using secured communications monitored by the FBI, they would leak information suggesting Sarah had separated from Thomas and taken Noah to her mother's house in Chicago, a vulnerable location compared to the safe house. In reality, a female FBI agent would pose as Sarah with a realistic doll standing in for Noah, while a tactical team waited to apprehend anyone who approached. "It's the best chance we have to catch Kemp and his team," Reynolds said. "Once they're in custody, the immediate threat to Noah ends." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. The plan made tactical sense, but the idea of deliberately attracting these people toward anyone, even a trained agent, felt wrong. "What about the bigger operation?" Sarah asked. "The international connections? The other children?" "We're working those angles simultaneously," Harding assured them. "Werner is cooperating to reduce his sentence. Every arrest gives us more leverage, more information. But right now, our priority is neutralizing the immediate threat to your family." Later that night, after the law enforcement officials had departed and Noah was finally asleep, Sarah and Thomas sat at the kitchen table with cups of cooling coffee, Duke alert at their feet. "I keep thinking about the other families," Sarah said quietly. "The ones who weren't as lucky as we were. The ones who really did bury empty coffins and never knew." Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. "Reynolds said they're reopening every suspicious infant death where Parker was involved. It won't bring those children back, but at least their parents might get answers." "That's not enough," Sarah insisted. "When this is over, if it's ever truly over, we need to do something more, something to prevent this from happening to other families." Thomas nodded slowly. "Maybe something with Duke." "A foundation to train dogs to work with vulnerable children or to help police with missing persons cases." At the sound of his name, Duke lifted his head, amber eyes moving between the two humans as if following their conversation. "He's more than a pet now," Sarah said, reaching down to stroke his fur. "He's the reason Noah is alive, the reason those people will be caught. He saw what all the humans missed." "Guardian angel with fur," Thomas murmured, repeating Barbara's phrase. As if understanding the weight of the conversation, Duke rose and padded to Noah's temporary crib in the corner of the living room, assuming his now familiar protective position beside the sleeping baby. His steady presence was the one certainty in their upended world, a reminder that sometimes the oldest instincts, a mother's love, a father's protection, a dog's loyalty, were more powerful than any human system. Tomorrow would bring more uncertainty, more fear, as the FBI implemented their plan to capture Kemp and his associates. But for tonight, watching Duke stand guard over their sleeping son, Sarah allowed herself to believe that eventually this nightmare would end, that someday they might return to a life where their greatest worry was ordinary parenting challenges, not international criminals seeking their child. "We'll get through this," Thomas said, as if reading her thoughts. "All four of us together." Sarah nodded, finding strength in the simple truth of his words. They had already survived the unimaginable, believing their son was dead, discovering the elaborate deception, rescuing him against impossible odds. Whatever came next, they would face it with the wisdom they'd gained. Trust the instincts that matter, question the authorities that fail, and never underestimate the power of a loyal heart, even one that beats beneath fur. In our darkest moments, when systems fail and experts let us down, sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. Duke's story reminds us that as we age, we shouldn't discount the instincts and intuition we've spent a lifetime developing. Many of us have felt dismissed by younger doctors, professionals, or even family members who prioritize technology and modern thinking over our hard-earned wisdom. Like Barbara Jenkins, who recognized Duke's behavior wasn't grief but an alert, we know things that can't always be explained by science or credentials. Our generation understands that bonds forged over time, whether with family, loyal pets, or trusted neighbors, often provide protection and insight that no security system or institution can match. Duke's unwavering loyalty to Noah represents the purest form of love protection without condition, devotion without expectation. Have you ever experienced a moment when your instincts proved right despite what experts told you? Or has a loyal pet ever shown extraordinary awareness that others couldn't understand? Share your stories in the comments below. Your wisdom matters more than you know.